Hello and welcome. Coming up tonight, as the Prime Minister arrives in Washington for his historic summit with Trump, I have an exclusive interview with the Foreign Secretary David Lammy about what Britain needs from the US President. And in London, Anushka speaks to ex-Secretary General of NATO, Fogh Rasmussen, about how vulnerable Europe has become.
Yes, and here in the studio, I'll use Screeny to look at Keir Starmer's about-turn on foreign aid and see if Labour's Rebecca Long-Bailey and former Conservative Minister Simon Clarke have any advice for the PM on how to handle Trump.
It's a watcher from Washington, D.C., just hours before Starmer's first summit with Donald Trump since Trump became president. Now, in decades of covering stuff like this, I've never known a meeting anticipated with such anxiety by British politicians of all parties. But, by contrast, in the most matter-of-fact way, by the American president himself, who entertains world leaders as if he is the great emperor and their courtiers. For Starmer, it must be terrifying, and shortly before he climbed aboard Air Force Number 10, the down-market airplane, the leaders of the Liberal Democrats and of the Tories both wished him the best of British luck, as if he was going to the front line. As another manifestation of who has the power, Starmer has massively accelerated his plans to increase defence spending to be in Donald Trump's good books, which Starmer is funding by reducing overseas aid by a staggering 40%. It isn't an exaggeration to say that Trump, just by agreeing to see Starmer, has caused the most radical upheaval of UK diplomatic and defence policies since the collapse of communism in the early 1990s. This may be democracy, but it feels like government of the UK by a billionaire elected by Americans. The problem for Starmer is that Trump is an emperor, exercising the Trumpian royal prerogative, his personal fiat to shape our security and prosperity like no Western leader of modern times, even if at times we think we don't know what he's doing. And although British ministers and officials do the conventional thing and talk to their American counterparts about whether Trump's planned tariffs are a good idea or whether it's in America's interest to flatter Putin and scale back support for Ukraine, they know this kind of conversation is probably futile, because in the end, Trump will do what Trump wants to do, and stuff even his closest colleagues, let alone the rest of us. Anushka.
Thank you, Robert. We are starting with a big trade-off between spending on defence and everything else the population needs. The Institute for Fiscal Studies analysis shows historic defence spending coming down over decades, the so-called peace dividend that gave us cash, lots of it to spend on other things. As defence fell, health spending in blue and social security in yellow both soared. So if defence spending is going to rise, not loads in a historical context, but to 2.5% and then up to 3% of national income, we are going to need to pay for it. We know that international aid is the first chosen punchbag. Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron set in law a requirement for governments to aim to spend 0.7% of GDP on aid up here, which happened until Boris Johnson said COVID demanded a temporary cut to 0.5%. Guess who was angry? Keir Starmer, who argued development aid reduces conflict. It is a false economy, he said, to pretend a cut like that does not have consequences. And actually, the cuts to foreign aid are even bigger because of this growing pink section, which is spending on refugees in this country. Now, Starmer said these Tory cuts would never be temporary. Will his now? After all, spending demands are going up, not down. It is $6 billion to reach 2.5% on defence, but to get to his 3%, it is $20 billion. To get to Trump's 5%, it is £80 billion. So why international aid? I suspect Downing Street have seen the polling. YouGov asked people, what would you cut first? And most said international aid. Second up, welfare, and I can tell you some mega cuts are coming there. Then the environment, although interestingly, defence is fourth. Now, for the earlier data, B. Boileau from the IFS is our Geek of the Week. And I'm just going to come over and talk to Becky and Simon about this. I mean, Becky, you've only just come back into the Labour Party. Are you comfortable with a Labour government slashing aid spending to less than half of what a Conservative Prime Minister wanted?
Well, on the issue of defence spending, I think it's the most important duty of any government to ensure it protects its people. So I think it's right to increase defence spending, particularly in this era of political and world instability. But I am concerned about looking at the foreign aid budget, and concerns have been raised from charities and organisations over the last few days about how ultimately there are unintended consequences, and that cutting the foreign aid budget actually creates more instability globally, because a lot of the money that we send over to vulnerable people helps to stabilise parts of the world that could spiral into conflict.
As Keir Starmer used to argue. But what would you cut
exactly?
instead?
I wouldn't cut anything. I think we need to.
Borrow more.
No, I think we need to look at different options. So one option that I've long advocated for is looking for a wealth tax. And there are groups such as Patriotic Millionaires UK who've been advocating for this for some time. And even if you just took a tax of 1 to 2% on assets of over £10 million, you'd generate £22 billion a year. You could spend that on defence, you could spend it on schools, you could spend it on skills. The answer's there.
Simon, do you agree with what the Prime Minister has done?
I think an increase in defence spending is welcome. The reality is that actually, as your graph showed, that it's not enough. And the uptick to 2.5% probably just allows us to stand still and to more realistically fund some of our existing commitments. 3% is better. I suspect we may need to go north of 3% in order to achieve a lasting peace. I think the Prime Minister is right to have taken money out of international aid. I think we should assert that a strong British military presence protecting peace in Europe and indeed around the world is a good thing, and that is itself something which is a global benefit. Beyond that...
So what, you're saying basically see defence spending as aid spending?
Well, see it as a form of a global good, as a contribution to global stability and security. But there is a wider point here, which is that our spending on welfare has, as you alluded, got completely out of control. That is a function of COVID. We've got 1.2 million more people of working age who are on benefits now. I would try and get us back to the position that we were in before the pandemic, which feels to me a very realistic target.
Which means taking a lot of money off poor people in this country.
Well, it means taking people out of welfare and into work, and spending on out-of-work benefits at 65 billion a year.
I mean, the Office for Budget Responsibility said your government's plans on this would take money off 400,000 and only put 15,000 back into work.
Well, I think we have to accept that the OBR's model is not always perfect. The wider point is 1.2 million more people are out of work, of working age, than there were in 2020. That's not sustainable.
Just very quickly, are you worried about these welfare cuts?
I'm incredibly worried. I had a meeting with disability campaigners this evening, and they were in tears. They're that frightened at potential cuts that could be coming down the track. And they don't like to be labelled as people who are essentially accepting benefits when they should be in the work, because they can't be in work. They're not able to be in work and they need support. And I think it's up to us to recognise that, yes, the government has to make difficult choices because the financial situation it inherited from the previous government was dire, but we've got to look at bold alternatives, and the wealth tax option that I expressed earlier, I think is one of those options that I hope the Chancellor will
come back to a lot of this. But now, here he is, over to Robert in Washington.
Thanks, Anushka. Now, a little earlier, I interviewed the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. This was his first interview since Keir Starmer slashed his aid budget. In the well-appointed House of the Deputy Ambassador here in Washington, I asked David Lammy what he hoped to gain from that historic summit between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump, which will take place tomorrow, when David Lammy will be in the room.
Well, look, in the end, this is the first meeting that the United Kingdom is obviously having with our American friends, where Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and Donald Trump are sitting down. Now, the truth is, I was with the Prime Minister in Trump Tower back in September. We had won an election. He had not yet won an election. And there have been a lot of phone calls in that space of time. but we're meeting at a time of war in Europe. The United States and President Trump intent to bring that war to an end. There are fundamental questions that sit within that. How do we get an enduring peace? How do we ensure that there's a US backstop to any security guarantees? How do we ensure that President Zelensky and the Ukrainians are part of any future negotiations with Russia? And of course, as you would expect, the UK and the United States do have a special relationship that is underpinned by strong defence collaboration and strong strategic intelligence collaboration. And so when we're sitting with the United States, our assessment of things on the ground and indeed of the security challenges that the world faces is a shared assessment, and there will be some detail in that conversation.
Now, the Prime Minister has made it clear that if we get what looks like a sustainable peace deal, we are prepared, along with France, to put boots of our soldiers on the ground, but subject to what he calls an American security backstop. What do we mean by an American security backstop?
Well, a backstop can be different things and in different theatres of conflict.
Are we talking about basically air power being available to us, or naval power, or both? What is it?
That is part of the discussion. In part, of course, it's about troop deployment, and that's troop deployment across Europe and across the NATO family, one.
Yeah. But hang on. America has said they will not deploy, so it's not across the NATO family because America will not deploy troops.
Well, let me finish the point, Robert. In part, it's about troops. America has been clear on troops in Ukraine. But of course, America does have troops, many, many tens of thousands of troops in Europe. That's hugely important because Poland, the Baltics and others would want to ensure that they're not putting troops in Ukraine and they're not covered in their own backyards, in their own country. So that's one. Two, yes, of course, it's about air defences. Three, it's about economic power and sanctions snapback. It's also about kit and military kit. For example, I think General Kellogg has talked, he certainly said this in the Munich Security Conference, it could be about ensuring that you have firepower, not necessarily in Ukraine, but around Ukraine that you can utilise if that tripwire is crossed, if security guarantees are breached. So there's a complexity to that, and yes, we will get into those sorts of discussions over the course of the next 48 hours.
And just in terms of this controversial minerals deal, which looks close to being agreed between America and Ukraine, where America takes ownership of these rather precious minerals, presumably we would see this as a good thing, because if America has an economic interest in Ukraine, then they're much more likely to defend Ukraine.
Well, we signed a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. It's a unique document. It's based on British business, British industry, defence capability, drone capability, people-to-people links over the course of the next 100 years. And in fact, when I was sat down with President Zelensky a couple of weeks ago, I said to him, mirror this with the United States.
So this is a good thing that's being negotiated?
It's most definitely a good thing, because in the end, if US interests are on the ground in Ukraine, then that is the best security guarantee that the Ukrainians can have. So I do hope they get that deal over the line in the next few days.
Now, I want to take us on to the increase in defence spending. You must be thrilled that the US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth has made some really positive statements about that increase in defence spending, but we're paying for it by a 40% reduction in the overseas aid budget. You must be shattered to see that overseas aid cut.
Well, look, this was a very difficult decision, and of course I'm saddened that we have had to reduce our development budget. But let's be clear, this was not an ideological decision in terms of development. This was a hard-headed decision in terms of the arsenal and the family of foreign policy and defence that you would expect a P5 nation like the UK to deploy at this most difficult of times. And what we are doing here is saying that hard power matters. It matters with war in Europe. It matters when the US clearly is focused on the Indo-Pacific, and we have to do more in terms of burden sharing, and it matters for global security. And so this is not a departure, if you like, from foreign policy. Development is a tool within that foreign policy. And I might say too that we will still be spending £9 billion in 2027 on development. We will still be amongst the top 7 nations on our development spend.
But maybe half of that will be on housing asylum seekers in the UK. It is not the soft power with the rest of the world that... I mean, only 2 weeks ago, Foreign Secretary, you said that it would be a strategic mistake to cut the aid budget because that would leave China more or less on its own, deploying these resources across the world and building up its influence.
Robert, this is a serious point. What I said is that I thought that the decision of the last Tory government to abolish DFID, which led to cliff edges, to put the money into a black hole was a huge strategic mistake. That is not the decision that the UK government has just made. The UK government has made a decision to put funds into hard power, hard foreign policies, the absolute opposite of what the Tories...
It's not development funding.
What keeps the world secure in the end? The deterrent. And let's be clear, Ernest Bevin and Attlee, after the Second World War, made a decision to rearm Britain after the Second World War. They took money from the NHS, they took money at that time from opticians and dental services to put into hard power. It was a Labour government that did that because they understood that there's a family of things that the UK deploys across our foreign policy portfolio. We will still, of course, be committed to development. We will still be spending money in Ukraine, in Gaza.
But it's a fraction of what we were spending.
It's not I don't think it's a fraction. £9 billion, and amongst the top...
It's a fraction. You're cutting it by 40%. I mean, it's just, this is language. This is a fact.
Robert, we will remain amongst the top 7 spenders in development in the world. We will still be committed to humanitarian...
But we were a world leader.
Let me finish the point. We will still be committed to humanitarian spend in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Gaza, most specifically. We will still be spending money on climate. We will still be spending money in North Africa. We will not be spending as much, of course, because at this strategic time, where we can all see that we're living in a dangerous world, we cannot leave the arsenal bare in terms of defence. And the first obligation of any country is the security of its citizens, and of course our responsibilities as global security, and that does mean, of course, the nuclear deterrent. This is a progressive realist decision that means the United Kingdom is making a realist assessment of the world as it is, not as we would wish it to be.
Yeah, but I still, I read your speech outlining your progressive realist agenda, which you gave only a few weeks ago, and the kind of soft power that we've just been discussing that's been cut was central to it. Now, you were told 72 hours ago this was a done deal, the budget was being cut. Was there a moment when you thought, the legs have been taken away from me, I've got to quit?
No. Absolutely not. I set out in opposition that we would be in a progressive, realist place. I have argued within government and outside of government that we do have to increase defence spending. I think it's right the Prime Minister has made an assessment that we must get there faster and quicker. And in the end, we're spending 66 billion on defence today. We will be spending 77 billion by 2027. That is hugely important. But it's also important that this is not an ideological retreat from soft power, from development. There are other countries making that decision. That's not the decision that the UK is making. We still have an ambition to get back to higher spending on development. We will still be amongst the top 7 nations in the world on development. But the poorest people in the world suffer when there are poor decisions made about defence spending. They've suffered as a consequence of war on Europe, and they would suffer more if there were more conflict on the European continent. Poor people suffer when you don't commit to the deterrent, which kept the world safe after the Second World War. Those are the hard-headed decisions that any serious foreign ministry, any serious defence ministry and development make at this very tough geopolitical time.
Now, obviously, because it was in your manifesto, you were committed to increasing defence spending, but you didn't in your manifesto say when we would reach this new level of 2.5%. You've only accelerated it because Trump's in the White House and the Prime Minister's going to see him.
No, I mean...
You've accelerated. You have... I mean, the Prime Minister more or less accepted that yesterday, that the acceleration was because of Trump being there.
The acceleration is because of a hard-headed judgment of the US and their obligations in the Indo-Pacific, a hard-headed judgment of UK leadership within NATO, and we will be now the second biggest spender on defence in NATO. That's hugely important, our leadership role in Europe. And yes, of course, that has accelerated now that the American...
Because you want to be able to tell President Trump on Thursday that we're there in a credible way.
It's not because of what we want to be able to tell President Trump, but obviously, clearly...
Come on. You can't believe that.
The American people made a decision in November to elect President Trump. He ran on a manifesto. He's now implementing that manifesto. As night follows day, you could trace the path on America's obligations in the Indo-Pacific and their reorientation in relation to Europe. That does mean that there's a response in the United Kingdom, and it has been a judgment. That judgment has been in the last few weeks that we need to go quicker and deeper in the UK, and that's the right decision, yes.
And can I just ask on the related military decision about Chagos and the transfer of sovereignty there? The Prime Minister said in the House of Commons that the deal is with the US and you can't make a final, formal, detailed announcement until you've heard from the US. But does that mean if President Trump says to you, we don't like this deal, that you'll tear it up?
Well, look, in the end, Diego Garcia is a military base, and it has capabilities on that military base that we share with our work together with our American friends. And I said before that on a military level and an intelligence level, we're very intertwined with the United States. We struck a deal. After striking that deal, there was a change of government in Mauritius, and the new government in Mauritius had to have time to look at the deal. And there has been a change of government here in the United States, and the United States administration have had time to look at the deal. I still believe it's the best deal.
But does President Trump have a veto?
Well, if President Trump doesn't like the deal will not go forward. And the reason for that is because we have a shared military and intelligence interest with the United States. And of course they've got to be happy with the deal, or there is no deal.
And just to be clear, do you know where the money for the deal, if it goes through, which budget it comes from? Does it come from your budget? Does it come from the defence budget? Where does it come from?
If there's a deal, then we will set that deal out as you would expect in the normal way. And people will be able to scrutinise the deal. But some of the figures I've seen knocked around are way off the truth.
Yeah. I mean, I've also done some of the... Foreign Secretary, as always, very good to see you.
Thank you.
Let's pick up on that interview with Rebecca and with Simon. Let me just start with you, Simon. You just heard there, if Donald Trump doesn't want the Chagos deal to go ahead, it won't go ahead. Are they dancing to the president's tune?
Well, they are, but they shouldn't be going ahead with this deal in the first place, right? I do reluctantly hope the president says no, but we should not be in that dynamic. This is a wretched deal driven by, I'm afraid, our complete frustration before the international law that the Prime Minister and the Attorney General love so much. This is British sovereign territory. It is absolutely crazy that at a time when, as we've heard, we're making very tough decisions to fund more defence spending, that we should be contemplating giving money to a Chinese ally to give away our own territory. That is madness.
But on that broader point, Rebecca, I mean, David Lammy, he was criticising US cuts to aid spending. Now he's defending them. He's relaxed about the minerals deal on Chagos. It's up to Donald Trump. Do you think they should show a bit more backbone? Stand up to the president?
I think they will do when they have to, but I think this first meeting is very much a meeting of kind of setting out your stall and building those close alliances. And there's going to be a number of topics that are going to be high on Keir's agenda. The first being Ukraine and support in that. The second being strategic defence and trying to unpick some of the comments that have been made by the White House recently that their focus isn't going to be on European security anymore. Keir will want to know what that means.
We're trying so hard to
make
get
sure
this right,
that we have that close relationship
show you
with
the
the
front
US.
cover of The Independent tomorrow. There has to be a line sometimes on some of these things. Did you see this video that Donald Trump has put out? An AI video of a remade Gaza with a golden statue of Donald Trump. Look, he's there on a beach with Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you think Keir Starmer should raise this with him?
I'm not sure of the origin of the video. I was a bit
He
perplexed.
posted it himself.
I know, I was a bit perplexed, if I'm honest. And I don't know if it was done in a tongue-in-cheek way or he was serious about it. But what I do know is that quite central to the discussions with the president will be Gaza, the rebuilding of Gaza and the preservation of peace within the region to make sure that all of the hostages are released and that Palestinians can return to their homes and are given support to rebuild
But
after
does
14
there become a moment,
agonising
just quickly on this
months.
point, when you're putting up a video like that, when you're saying today, as Trump did, that the EU was set up basically, you know, to whack the US, to screw the US, I think was his language. Is enough enough? Do you have to draw a line? Just quickly.
Well, I would take issue much more with the president's mischaracterisation of the war in Ukraine than I would with the video. The video is offensive and ridiculous, but actually the most serious thing that the president's done in recent days is to call Zelensky a dictator and to question whether Ukraine is at fault for the war. That is wrong, and that is where the British government should draw the line.
OK, we've got lots more with both of you after the break, and I'll also be talking to former NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Do stay with us.
Really strong.
Oh, we're talking about the break. It would help if I pulled it in. We're talking about the relationships between presidents and prime ministers over time. Which of these do you think were particularly close?
I think that one.
Yeah,
that one.
What do you think made it so close?
I think it was a genuine personal
Ideological.
bond.
Yeah.
But
You think ideology, you think...
Well, I think it was
personal.
both, right? They were kindred souls, and I
Yeah.
think they saw in each other something which, you know, was what transcended like normal politeness. This was probably the most consequential meeting of minds of the post-war era.
Again, I think ideological. I think they were both politically on the same page.
Although, I don't know if we've still got it, but, I was going to say, Blair was pretty close to George W. Bush as well.
Yes, yes.
You can imagine these two getting together, can't you?
You can. Two very polished individuals.
Very polished. That's a polite way. Well, what do you mean by polished?
Well, I look back
I think there's a word under there.
I look back at the decisions of that era, whether it be our relationship with China on our side or Obama dismissing the Russian threat on the other, and the foreign policy of that era looks pretty naive now.
OK. Have I got any others in here? Let's have a look. What about May and Trump? What would you have done if he held your hand?
Rebecca, I doubt you've been holding
I
my
wouldn't have
hand.
been that bothered about it, to be perfectly honest.
You've been fine.
I think Theresa May did a very good job, I must say, on that occasion, of dealing with a pretty bizarre...
Yeah.
I can imagine these two getting on.
I think Trump respects Boris in a way which he doesn't...
You can see it on his face.
Yeah, he
Do you
takes
think,
Boris seriously.
Tell me about your party. Do you need this man back?
Well, I think there is always going to be a role for Boris Johnson in the Conservative Party.
As leader?
Well, look, we have an excellent leader in the form of Kemi Badenoch. I think
If things don't work out?
the reality is that with Boris, you will never say never, because that's the nature of the man. But at this
Never
point in
say
time,
never.
our focus needs to
Okay.
be on rebuilding.
Never to say never. Thank you both. Welcome back. More from Becky and Simon in the moment. But first, we got a big report today from the Climate Change Committee on what we need to do as a country to stay on track for net zero. The focus of the report was the period 2038 to 2042. And this chart sums up some of the stuff they were saying. So above the line here, above the middle line, all these bars, is all the money we need to spend. So capital expenditure on things like the electricity supply in yellow, on buildings in orange, and other areas in red. And below the lines are the savings we get in return for all of that. The white line gives us the average. And what it shows is that this journey to net zero is costing us right now from 2025 up to 2030 and beyond, but in 2040, we go below the line. And from that point on, we will be making pretty big savings. But how do we get there, given all the other spending demands that we are now facing? If I just bring back up that pie chart on what the public would like to see cut, the environment here in green is actually the third biggest. And some of the asks to get to net zero feel quite difficult. Look at some of the headlines from that report today. Do you want to be told to skip 2 kebabs a week, 2 kebabs worth of meat, or to install a heat pump, or to fly less? Let me go and talk to Simon and Becky about this. I mean, you've seen it. This is quite an important thing that we're still trying to do. But it's really politically tricky, isn't it, right now?
It is, and I think it's important for politicians to explain the situation, because there are huge economic possibilities if we harness what I was calling the green revolution a few years ago. And by just investing something like, I think it was 1% of GDP, you could see returns of up to 1.8 billion, I think it was. We did a report, 30 by 2030, in about 2018, 2019, highlighting a few different proposals that a Labour government could take forward. But it can't be done on the backs of working people. People have to be able to afford.
So how do you take people with you?
Exactly. Well, you have to have different types of schemes to ensure that it's affordable for people. And obviously, I'm a huge advocate of publicly owned energy to ensure that you have the infrastructure and the control to be able to do that. And it's not something that we're taking forward policy-wise at the moment in terms of the public ownership aspect. And
Simon, you believe in net zero, but think about reform right now. This is a big thing for them, that people do not want this. You saw that polling. Lots of people would like to see these costs cut.
Well, a lot of very strong reform voters don't like it, but actually the majority of voters do. And I think it's very important when we consider this issue to remember that actually there is broad support for rational decarbonisation. I think what we have to avoid, though, is the kind of hair shirt punishment aspects.
What, like eating fewer kebabs?
I think
who eats that many kebabs in a week?
Guilty secrets, and my love of a pie is well known, but the reality is that if we're talking about making it harder for families to go on holiday, if we're talking about it not being right to eat meat, we're going to lose people. And
but this is tricky.
That is not
Keir Starmer has put out a target from the Climate Change Committee's own report of where he wants to get with this. But when I asked him, when I travelled with him to a conference actually in Azerbaijan last year, he said exactly this: I'm not going to tell people to do anything differently. Can we get there if we don't do things differently?
I don't think you can force people to make individual changes, because this was one of the things that really annoyed me about climate change and the coal argument about it, that it was your fault because you weren't buying the right kind of tomatoes or you were going on holiday to Mallorca once a year. You can't blame people for climate change. It's something that's happened over decades, and we've got to change that together, and it has to be government-led. So making sure that we have that infrastructure and an industrial strategy in place to do that, I think, is important, and take the individual responsibility away from it. So if you want to eat kebabs, but make sure that we've got the infrastructure in place to have clean energy by 2030.
And all of that I completely agree with, you'll be pleased to hear. The one thing I would say is the hardest yards are yet to come, right? So the decarbonisation of energy, we are well on the way to achieving. Decarbonisation of transport, I can see how we'll go a long way towards that. Homes, those issues, those hardest to reach things are going to be very tough.
Very, very tough. And the additional tough thing is all the demands for spending on defence. In a moment, I'm going to be talking to the former Prime Minister of Denmark and the former Secretary-General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. But first, I want to talk about defence spending. This is a NATO chart, a little bit complicated, but stay with me. The numbers in this direction refer to defence spending as a share of GDP. So the biggest spenders will be up this end. And going up is how much countries spend on much needed equipment. The green lines are the NATO targets, 20% on equipment, but this is the really important one, 2% of GDP on defence. So did countries meet that in 2023? The answer is not really, but let me just show you some of them. Here's Poland, right out here, spending almost 4% of its GDP on defence and more than half of that on equipment. The USA, much less on equipment, but still well over 3% of GDP. Here we are on 2.3%. Look at Canada, not looking great at all the way down here. But actually, lots of countries are below the target. The overall medians are represented by the blue lines, absolutely fine for equipment, but below the target for overall defence spending. Now, pressure ramped up as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continued. And by 2024, this had shifted. You can see lots of countries jumping up over there. Although, just to point out, Canada still down here, Spain still quite a long way up. But the median has gone above that NATO target of 2%. The problem is that the world is even less secure now. Lots of people would like us to go to 3%, and you can see how many countries are back there. And as for Trump's 5%, that takes us off this chart, past Poland and a long way past the USA as well. I started by asking the former NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen how he felt when Donald Trump recently described Ukraine's President Zelensky as a dictator.
It's unbelievable. I mean, to call Zelensky a dictator while it is Putin who is the real dictator, it's horrendous, actually. So it's a significant sign of the new world order where in Europe we cannot count automatically on help from the US. We have to stand on our own feet.
Let's talk about defence spending. I've just put up a chart that shows the NATO median for defence spending has now crossed 2%, but only just. Britain now says it will go to 2.5%. Is that enough?
No, it's not enough. I think we will have to reach a level of 4%, and I find it quite embarrassing that there are still 9 out of the 32 allies that do not live up to the NATO target of investing at least 2% of GDP in defense. And in the meantime, the goalpost has moved. Russia has rearmed, and we have to follow suit in Europe.
But no one is at 4%, not even Poland are quite there. And, you know, one of the other things we've talked about here are the trade-offs. Are you comfortable with the world's poorest being hit, with welfare being hit, stopping the work towards climate change to pay for this?
I also prefer to invest money in healthcare, in childcare, in elderly care, in schools. I also want to combat climate change, etc. But we have to realize that none of those values are worth anything if we are not able to defend our countries. And this is the reason why we have to step up to the plate. Now, Russia has rearmed so that the total investment in Russia is now equivalent to the total defense investment in the whole of Europe.
And meanwhile, while this is happening, and like I say, no one's anywhere near, well, not many are very near 4%. We have a situation with this presidency in the US where every day seems to bring a shocking comment, and today is no different. Donald Trump has said that the European Union was formed in order to screw the US. How do you even respond to that?
Yeah, but of course, it's a ridiculous statement. And now I understand that Trump threatens with a trade war, higher tariffs. Trade wars are a disaster. Trade wars have only losers. The consumers will have to pay higher prices, and tariffs protect inefficient industries at home.
But you want Europe to retaliate.
Absolutely. I think the European Union should retaliate determinedly and strongly.
Don't go away. More from that interview after the break, and we'll be back with Robert in Washington. Hello, welcome to the second break. Hashtag Peston. Did you see this? The email that Elon Musk sent out to government workers?
Yeah.
Reply with approximately 5 bullet points of what you accomplished last week and CC your manager. Deadline is Monday at 11:59. Why 11:59? And if not, I think he said he was going to sack them. So, I'm a bit like Elon. There we go. I want 5 things from each of you that you did last week. What did you
Becky, do you
achieve?
want to go first, or...?
You'll just want more time to remember, don't you?
OK, well, I will volunteer to go first. So, in the spirit of good discipline, so I run a think tank called Onward these days. And so what have we done in the last week? I signed off a new report on energy transmission, and I wrote an opinion piece which has been published tomorrow about that. I have had meetings with our donors to try and raise more money to fund our development. Had meetings with our business partners to make sure we're getting their views on board. And we have also had meetings to determine our future strategy, including economy.
Right, you can keep your job. Come on then, Becky, what about you?
So I had more than 5 meetings with various different constituents in my office.
Yeah, that's one.
To help out with their issues. I can't mention the names, obviously, for confidentiality reasons. I went to an awards ceremony in my constituency for Hong Kongers who settled in Salford, and it was to celebrate their volunteers.
What were the awards? Oh, volunteering.
Volunteer awards, yeah, to celebrate what they've been doing to reach out in the community and whatnot. So that was nice. I had a meeting with our Salford mayor to discuss how we can work together on various issues. And I also helped out my mum because she's not very well. So I did some cleaning and helped her.
That's nice.
Some of the things
That's 4 though. Is it? I can't count.
And I did the washing in the house and made sure that all my son's uniforms were ironed and ready for this week.
Can I say, I'm really impressed because when people say to me, what did you do over the weekend? I can never remember anything. I can't remember the last minute, never mind the last week. Elon Musk would have me fired. Bye. Welcome back. In the next part of my interview, I asked Anders Fogh Rasmussen about comments made by the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. Merz said he thinks Trump doesn't really care about the fate of Europe and that NATO in its current form may cease to exist. So I asked the former NATO Secretary-General if he thought the alliance could survive this presidency.
Yes, because NATO has survived ups and downs since its establishment in 1949. But I agree with Merz that it will not be a NATO as we knew it in advance. I think in the past, I think Europe needs to increase its investment so that we get a more fair burden sharing within NATO. For instance, we could create a coalition of the willing in Europe, led by France and the UK, who could invest much more in defence.
And would you actually want a European army?
I think it's too theoretical to speak about a European army in the short term, but I would very much like to see a coalition of the willing, consisting of France, the UK, Germany, the Baltic states, Poland, the Nordics, with a capability and a willingness to invest what is needed.
And just let me ask you this. What did you make of Donald Trump's grab for Greenland?
Well, first of all, that will not happen. But of course, it is a matter of concern that the leader of the biggest nation within NATO threatens an ally to grasp territory by force. I'm sure that Putin and Xi Jinping listen carefully, because if Trump can get land by force, why couldn't they?
So you think
take
Trump is like
and
Putin?
Taiwan? Beg your pardon?
Do you think Trump is like Putin?
Well, I think his rhetorics are very similar to the rhetorics of Putin and Xi Jinping.
And is that rhetoric something that we should be worrying about in security terms as well?
Of course, we should be very much concerned about it. I think we are approaching a new world order where, according to Trump's vision, we will have 3 power centers in the US, Russia, and China. And the loser will be Europe. And that's why we in Europe, we should stand together, step up investments in our own security.
And just very super quick final question. Is there any chance of Ukraine joining NATO?
Hope so, and I think so, down the road. That would be the most efficient and the least expensive way to guarantee security of Ukraine in the future and avoid future Russian attacks on Ukraine.
Thank you very, very much for your time.
You're welcome.
So that was Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Let's talk about all of this. Robert, one thing that the former NATO Secretary General just said is that Trump's rhetoric is quite similar to Putin's or to Xi Jinping's. It makes him a difficult guy to deal with, doesn't it? I mean, what does Keir Starmer hope to get out of the meeting tomorrow?
Well, it certainly makes it very hard to deal with, and that's not the only reason it makes it hard to deal with, because, you know, I've been speaking a lot to British officials, British ministers involved in this preparation for this first big summit between Donald Trump as the new president and Keir Starmer. And they say they've been doing, you know, endless preparation, writing on whiteboards, getting in advice from everywhere. But they then say, but the problem is, when we also then talk to other people who've been in summits like this, they say it's completely unpredictable. You have no idea where the conversation is going to go. You have no idea where, you know, what Trump is going to say. I mean, some of the stories that I've been told about how he has sort of manipulated and sort of hijacked the agenda of other world leaders, pretty hair-raising. Now, there are 2 big things that Keir Starmer, in an ideal world, would like to talk about, but he'll already know when he lands here in Washington in about 2 hours that one of them is going to be exceptionally difficult. You know, you heard from David Lammy when I was chatting to him just now that what they want is a guarantee from the Americans, from Donald Trump, that if there is some kind of peace deal between Ukraine and Moscow, that, you know, if there is some kind of peace deal, that even though the immediate policing will be done by countries like the UK and France, our troops will go into Ukraine to sort of protect the borders, they want a promise from Donald Trump that if all goes to hell in a handcart, you know, American planes, American warships will be available. Well, Trump has said today that he ain't going to provide that kind of backstop. So he's sort of rejected what Keir Starmer wants even before the meeting. Now, maybe he'll change his mind tomorrow. That's not impossible. The other thing that Keir Starmer wants, and this is actually the reason why Peter Mandelson has been appointed as the new British ambassador here, is he wants a partnership on technology, a partnership on developing tech industries in both countries. And this, in a sense, I think Mandelson sees as sort of completing his sort of life's work in doing these sorts of deals with other countries. We'll see whether Trump wants to play ball on any of that.
Yeah, because he can just say all sorts of things in all sorts of moments. I mean, just let me ask you both about this. Do you think, Becky, that this could be make or break for Keir Starmer? He's had a bumpy first year so far. Can this turn things around, or could it be a complete flop?
I think when it comes to foreign policy issues, I don't think you think about your poll ratings, you think about the interests of the country and what you need to do.
I think Prime Ministers always think about the poll ratings.
I think the right kind of Prime Minister thinks about the right thing to do, not the polls. That's when you know you've got a good Prime Minister, and that's what I hope Keir does tomorrow when he meets the President. But ultimately, I think he's got to win friends and influence people and start to foster that strong relationship, because good deals come out of good relationships. You can't just throw your cards on the table and expect the magic to happen. You have to start building those bridges. And
Sound like Donald Trump, Becky.
I know.
I mean, and Simon, there's another man, British politician, who's got quite a good relationship with Donald Trump, Nigel Farage. I mean, how do you think he's faring with all of this? And how much of a problem is he for your party at the moment?
I don't think Nigel Farage has any serious role in tomorrow's talks, and nor should he, right? He doesn't speak for the government.
Do you think his
of the United
relationship has
Kingdom.
reduced with Donald Trump?
I suspect it has always suited Nigel Farage to big it up in a way which I'm not sure the President would say matches his estimation of that relationship. I don't doubt there is a rapport of sorts, but it's certainly not the best buddies thing that we often hear from Nigel.
Can I just mention quickly, I know that you're very supportive of your current leader, Kemi Badenoch, but just in the break I asked you what you thought of Boris Johnson. You said never say never.
Well, you can never say never with Boris. That's the nature of the man.
Would you like to see him back one day?
I want to see Kemi Badenoch as Prime Minister of this country, and I genuinely believe that she is the right leader for this extraordinary moment where we need to rebuild our party.
Do you think she's doing well, Becky?
I can't really possibly comment. I'm not a Tory, am I? I mean,
You are allowed to comment on other parties.
I'm just saying that no Tories do well, but just respect their views.
Robert, what do you think the Conservatives will be looking at this and watching? Will they be supporting Keir Starmer to do well? Did you hear me there, Robert?
Line's gone. Oh, sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Sorry.
I said, what do you think the Conservatives will be watching on and thinking about this? What do you think Nigel Farage will be thinking? Will they be willing Keir Starmer to do well?
So look, one of the things that was really striking today, and actually I found it slightly unnerving, I mentioned this right at the start, is the way that Kemi Badenoch and the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, both basically looked at Keir Starmer with intense sympathy, said basically this relationship with America is important, and they weren't at all sure that any Prime Minister was going to prosper tomorrow. Anyway, we will see, as it were. I'm sure that Nigel Farage would love Keir Starmer to slip on a banana skin, because that is, the nature of what he wants at the moment. Now, that's it for tonight from here in Washington and in London. Next week, we'll chew over whatever emerges from that Trump and Starmer meeting, but no one knows what that will be, least of all, the American president himself. Goodbye.